In the summer of 1945, 18 men step out of a transport plane into smoke instead of gunfire. Below them, a forest in eastern Oregon is burning, and somewhere in the ash is a bomb that crossed 6,000 miles of open ocean to start the fire. The men dropping into it are fully qualified paratroopers, trained at the same elite jump school that produced the men who dropped into Normandy. Not one of them has ever jumped into a battle. They are the first black paratroopers in the history of the United States Army, and for 2 years, the war they trained for refused to let them through the door. This is the closest thing to combat any of them will see in this war, and it is happening at home, against an enemy almost nobody outside the Army has even been told exists. Their story starts in 1943, on a different kind of field, the parade ground at the Army's parachute school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where a young sergeant named Walter Morris guarded equipment from 4 in the afternoon until the white trainees came back the next morning. Morris and his men were the post-segregated service company, a janitorial detail in uniform, watching white soldiers earn wings they themselves would never be allowed to wear. Morris later remembered walking past the post-exchange and watching German and Italian prisoners of war sitting inside, smoking and drinking, while he and his men, wearing the same American uniform, were not permitted through the door. So Morris started something nobody ordered him to do. After hours, with no authorization and no equipment, he had his men run the same calisthenics and tower drills the white paratrooper candidates ran by day, counting off cadence like men already qualified. It was supposed to be for morale. It became something else. One evening in late 1943, Brigadier General Ridgely Gaither, who commanded the entire parachute school, drove past the field and saw 50 black soldiers training in unison after dark, like men who expected to be called. He didn't punish Morris. He promoted him. Gaither had a reason to be ready. Pressure had been building in Washington for almost a year. A War Department advisory committee on black troop policy, pushed by black newspapers demanding combat roles instead of only labor battalions, had recommended forming an all-black parachute unit back in December 1942. The recommendation had simply stalled in the chain of command. Now Gaither had his answer standing in front of him on a drill field after dark. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall approved starting with a single company rather than a full battalion, and on December 30, 1943, the 555th Parachute Infantry Company was activated at Fort Benning, Georgia, the United States Army's first all-black airborne unit. Walter Morris, the guard who had broken the rules to keep morale alive, was named its first sergeant. The Army still had to prove the unit could fly. Officially, the doubt was framed in clinical language, over whether men assigned for years to support duty had the intestinal fortitude to jump from a plane. It had never been tested on black soldiers, and some officers said so to their faces. 20 men were picked for what the Army called a test platoon, recruited from volunteers who had to be better than good enough to even apply, former college students, decorated non-commissioned officers, and 17 men transferred in from the all-black 92nd Infantry Division, the storied Buffalo Soldiers. They went through the same brutal weeks at jump school that washed out plenty of white candidates, tower jumps, equipment drills, 5 qualifying jumps from a moving aircraft, and on February 18, 1944, 17 of them graduated and pinned on silver wings. America's first black paratroopers had just answered the only question the Army had ever really asked them. When we had the opportunity to become paratroopers, Morris said later, that lifted our morale and self-esteem, because now we were paratroopers, and not servants. They took their nickname from arithmetic and history at once. 3 buffalo nickels, arranged in a triangle, became their insignia, a nod to the Buffalo Soldiers who had filled their ranks, worn under a white parachute with a black panther crouched on top. Their numerical designation did the rest. The 555th became, in the soldiers' own spelling, the Triple Nickels. Word of the new unit spread through every black regiment in the Army, and men who had spent the war driving trucks and digging latrines lined up to try out for one of the hardest schools in the military. By November 25, 1944, the company had grown into a full battalion at Camp Mackle, North Carolina, more than 300 trained, jump-qualified men, organized exactly like any other airborne battalion bound for Europe or the Pacific. They trained the same way. They expected to fight the same war. Then, that December, came the moment that should have sent them overseas. Hitler's army tore through the Ardennes in the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, and the Allied airborne divisions in Europe, bled white from Normandy and Holland, needed every trained paratrooper they could find. For a brief window, Airborne Command actually weighed reorganizing the 555th into a single reinforced rifle company and rushing it across the Atlantic to reinforce the battered lines. Then the German offensive collapsed faster than anyone expected. The emergency passed before the orders were cut, and the call to fly to Europe never came. What came instead was silence, and then, months later, a posting nobody in the battalion had asked for. Decades afterward, Morris gave the blunter explanation the official paperwork never put in writing. No field commander in Europe or the Pacific, he said, wanted colored troops mixing with their racist white troops, and so, in his words, the army was stuck with us. Stuck, but not finished. In the spring of 1945, with Germany collapsing and the Pacific War grinding toward its bloodiest island battles yet, the War Department finally found the 555th a mission. It was not the one they had trained for, and almost nobody on either coast would be allowed to know about it for months. The threat the army needed them for was already crossing the ocean. Since November 1944, Japan had been launching paper hydrogen balloons into the jet stream, roughly 9,000 of them launched in total, each one rigged with incendiary bombs and a high explosive charge, drifting unmanned across the Pacific toward the forests of the American West. It was the first weapon system in history with intercontinental range, decades before anyone built a missile to match it. The US government clamped a total press blackout on the story, afraid that public panic, or worse, Japanese confirmation that the balloons were actually landing, would only make the weapon more dangerous than it already was. On May 5, 1945, the silence cost 6 American lives, a pastor's pregnant wife and 5 children from his Sunday school class, killed instantly when they found a balloon bomb tangled in the brush near Bly, Oregon, and tried to pull it free. They remained the only people killed by enemy action on the American mainland in the entire war. Almost no one outside Japan's own high command knew that week that the balloon campaign had already been quietly shut down a month earlier, in April, after Japanese officers concluded, wrongly, and far too late for that family, that it had failed completely. Only after the deaths at Bly did the government finally lift its own blackout and warn the public what had been drifting overhead for months, while quietly paying the bereaved families a few $1,000s apiece in compensation. That was the war the 555th was sent to fight. In May 1945, roughly 300 triple Nickles boarded trains for Pendleton, Oregon, and Chico, California, under orders so classified the men themselves were not told what Operation Firefly meant until they arrived. The U.S. Forest Service met them at Pendleton and explained the real assignment: train alongside Army ordnance crews to find and disarm balloon bombs hidden in the forest canopy before they touched off a fire season that could burn through the West Coast's old-growth timber, and if a fire had already started, jump straight into the smoke after it. The men who had trained for 2 years to fight the Wehrmacht traded their rifles for let-down ropes and fire tools, and within weeks, an all-black combat battalion had become the United States military's first paratrooper smoke jumpers. It was every bit as dangerous as combat, just without an enemy shooting back. The Forest Service kit them out in 2-piece leather jumpsuits, similar to the gear bomber crews wore at altitude, with wire mesh face masks to stop a branch from taking out an eye on the way down. Crews leapt from C-47 transports into stands of timber 100 feet tall, snagged in the canopy on purpose, then lowered themselves hand over hand on a let-down rope through smoke that could blind a man before he ever found the fire line. Already trained in handling explosives, the triple Nickles doubled as their own bomb disposal experts, and once on the ground, a detachment might stay for days at a time, living off whatever they had jumped in with, until a Forest Service mule train could pack in relief and supplies. Across that one summer and fall, the battalion answered call after call across Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Northern California, more than 1,200 individual jumps into terrain so remote a parachute was the only way in. Paratroopers who jumped into actual combat in Europe that war averaged fewer than 10 jumps each before it was over. The triple Nickles, fighting fires nobody back home was allowed to read about, averaged more than 40, and even in Pendleton itself, the town whose surrounding forests they were protecting, restaurants and bars routinely refused to serve them. The bill came due on August 6, 1945. Private First Class Malvin L. Brown, a battalion medic working a fire deep in Oregon's Umpqua National Forest, was descending a let-down rope from a tree nearly 140 feet tall when he lost his grip and fell to the rocks below. He became the first smoke jumper in American history to die in the line of duty, on the same day the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a collision of headlines that left almost no room for his own. More than 30 other men in the battalion were hurt that season: broken bones, a crushed chest, a fractured spine, fighting a danger most of the country never knew their own army had sent black paratroopers into. By October, the fire season was ending, and so was the war. The 555th packed up Operation Firefly and returned east, first to Camp Mackle and then to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the battalion was handed the worst housing on the post, proof that the uniform alone hadn't ended the discrimination. Even after a summer spent protecting the homeland nobody back east had thanked them for. 2 years later, that changed for good. The Army folded the 555th into the 82nd Airborne Division under General James Gavin, the most storied airborne division in the country, and one that had never carried a black soldier on its rolls, and the Triple Nickles did not just join it quietly. By every account, they earned it, barracks integrated without incident, training records that spoke for themselves, men who had jumped into burning forests when nobody else in the Army was asked to. On December 15, 1947, the battalion was formally inactivated, and its men became the 3rd Battalion of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, full, permanent integration inside a United States Army combat unit, 7 months before President Truman signed the executive order that was supposed to make that happen across the entire military. Some of them eventually got the combat they had trained for after all. Captain Bradley Biggs, the only black officer in the Army to serve in both armor and parachute units, logged over 360 jumps in his career and later wrote the battalion's own history. Major James C. Queen, who had jumped into Pacific Northwest fires as a young Triple Nickel, went on to help form the core of the all-volunteer 2nd Ranger Infantry Company, which fought in Korea. He came home with a Silver Star, a Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart, and in 1994 became the first African American inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame. The training the Army had refused to use against Hitler or Japan's army did not go to waste. It simply waited for a different war to call it. Recognition for the original battalion took even longer. It was not until 2017 that Oregon placed a state historic marker outside the Smoke Jumper Museum in Cave Junction, honoring a unit that had risked its life jumping into the state's burning forest more than 70 years earlier. Walter Morris lived long enough to see his unit remembered, decades after most of the country had forgotten it. Looking back on what the Triple Nickles had actually accomplished, he never claimed more than the record allowed. "We didn't win any wars," he said, "but we did contribute. What we proved was that the color of a man has nothing to do with his ability." They had trained for 2 years to jump into the heart of Hitler's Europe and were never given the chance. Instead, they jumped into burning American forests that almost no one was watching, hunting a weapon their own country was too frightened to even name out loud, and in doing so, they proved exactly what the Army had spent 2 years pretending it did not already know.